The divorce papers landed on the table like a slap. Margaret Sterling didn't slide them across. She dropped them, deliberately, from height, so the sound cracked through the conference room like a gavel. Then she leaned forward, both palms flat on the mahogany, close enough that Claire could smell her perfume, and said, "Sign it. Take nothing, and disappear before you embarrass yourself further." Claire's hands were shaking under the table. Nobody could see that. She made sure of it. If you've ever sat across from someone who had everything, money, lawyers, a last name that opened doors, and felt completely alone in that room, then you already know what Claire felt in that moment. What would you have done? This is her story, and I promise you, it goes places nobody saw coming. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and stay with me until the very end. Drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves you, hit that like button. Now, let's go. The morning of the divorce finalization, Claire Bennett woke up at 4:47 a.m. in a hotel room she was paying for herself, in a city that had never fully accepted her, and stared at the water stain on the ceiling until the alarm went off at 6. She hadn't slept more than 3 hours. She'd spent most of the night going over the documents her attorney had faxed over, not reading them carefully, just touching the pages, like somehow the texture of the paper would tell her something the words wouldn't. The settlement was there in black and white. $3.4 million, a Manhattan apartment on the Upper West Side, a vehicle allowance, monthly payments continuing through the next decade. All she had to do was sign. She showered, dried her hair with a towel that was slightly damp from the day before, and put on the gray blazer she'd bought 3 years ago for a Sterling Industries quarterly dinner. It still fit. She'd lost weight she hadn't intended to lose. The blazer hung slightly off her left shoulder. She fixed it in the mirror, told herself she looked fine, and believed it for approximately 4 seconds. The law offices of Hargrove, Crane and Associates occupied the 31st floor of a building on Park Avenue where the elevator required a key card and the receptionist wore a headset like she was managing air traffic. Claire arrived 12 minutes early. She sat in a chair near the window, looked out at the city still gray with early morning, and drank the coffee someone handed her without asking who she was or why she was there. That was the last ordinary moment of her day. The Sterlings arrived at 8 on the dot. Not just her ex-husband, Davis. All of them. Margaret Sterling led the procession. 71 years old, silver hair pulled back so tightly, it looked like a structural decision, wearing a wool coat that cost more than Claire's monthly rent. Behind her came Davis, who wouldn't look up from his phone. Then the family attorney, Gerald Voss, who had been the Sterling family's legal counsel for 23 years and moved through the world like a man who had never once been told no. 2 assistants followed, and then, almost as an afterthought, Davis's younger sister, Helena, who had the specific talent of making you feel invisible while standing directly in front of you. They settled across the long conference table. Gerald Voss opened his briefcase. The stenographer set up her equipment. Claire's attorney, a competent but visibly anxious man named Tom Decker, adjusted his collar twice. Nobody acknowledged Claire directly. This was standard, she had learned. The Sterlings didn't look at people they considered resolved. And in their minds, Claire Bennett, the woman from Billings, Montana, who had stumbled into their family 5 years ago when Davis hired her as a junior communications consultant, was a resolved matter, a bill that was about to be paid and filed away. What happened next is the part she replays. Gerald Voss was mid-sentence, explaining the terms of the liquidation provision, when Margaret Sterling placed one hand flat on the table and simply interrupted him. "Claire?" Her voice wasn't loud. It never needed to be. "We've been patient. Davis has been generous beyond what you deserve. I'm going to need you to stop wasting everyone's time and sign those papers this morning." Tom Decker started to speak. Margaret didn't look at him. "I'm not speaking to you," she said. Claire kept her eyes level. She'd practiced that. Eyes level, hands still, breathe from your stomach. She'd learned that in her 3rd year with the Sterlings, when she finally accepted that every family dinner was a test she hadn't been told she was taking. "I've reviewed the terms," Claire said. "I have some questions about the non-disclosure provisions." "Your questions," Margaret said, "are not relevant." "Margaret, Davis finally looked up from his phone. Not at Claire. At his mother. A warning, maybe, or just reflex. Margaret ignored him too. There's a settlement on that table that will allow you to walk away from this situation with your dignity reasonably intact. She paused on that word. Reasonably. If you're going to pretend that anything about this negotiation is a negotiation, I'll need to revise my assessment of how intelligent you actually are. The room was very quiet. Claire looked at the papers in front of her. The number was real. The apartment was real. The monthly payments were real. Everything she needed to start over, actually start over, with breathing room, with options, was sitting there waiting for her signature. She picked up the pen Tom Decker had placed near her right hand. She held it for a moment. Then she set it down. I'm not signing this, she said. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence. It had weight. Tom Decker inhaled sharply beside her. Gerald Voss paused his typing. Helena Sterling finally looked up from her phone. Davis closed his eyes briefly, the way you do when you've been expecting bad news, and it finally arrives exactly as predicted. Margaret Sterling, for the first time in the 2-hour proceeding, actually looked at Claire, really looked at her. Excuse me, she said. The tone was precise, careful, the kind of careful that precedes something dangerous. I'm not taking the settlement, Claire said. I'm not taking the apartment. I'm not taking the money. She put the pen down further from her hand, as if creating distance from it on purpose. I'd like the marriage dissolved and nothing else. The confusion on Margaret's face lasted exactly 2 seconds before it resolved into something colder. That, Margaret said quietly, is the single stupidest thing I've ever heard a grown woman say. Maybe, Claire said, but it's what I'm doing. Tom Decker leaned toward her and whispered urgently that they should take a recess. She told him they didn't need one. He sat back in his chair with the expression of a man who had just watched someone voluntarily step in front of a vehicle. Gerald Voss cleared his throat and began explaining, in the measured tone of a man who charged $800 an hour, that Mrs. Bennet should understand the complexity of the assets at stake, the length of the marriage, the lifestyle considerations. Claire stopped listening about 40 seconds in, not out of rudeness. She'd just made her decision, and she didn't need it explained back to her. Davis spoke once more, low and direct, across the table. Claire, don't do this. She met his eyes. 5 years. She had spent 5 years trying to read that face, trying to figure out where the man she'd married ended and the family he came from began. She still didn't have a clean answer. I already did it, she said. The papers were gathered. The meeting ended. Margaret Sterling stood without another word, buttoned her coat, and left the room with the smooth efficiency of someone who had already begun calculating her next move before the door closed behind her. She was right to start calculating, because what happened in the 3 weeks that followed was not a coincidence, and it was not organic, and it was not the natural consequence of a messy divorce in a media-saturated city. It was a campaign. The first story appeared on a gossip platform Claire had never heard of. The headline called her a social climber who had targeted Davis Sterling at a corporate event. The article was vague enough to be unprovable, but specific enough to feel credible. It mentioned Montana, the word used in a way that made a place feel like a character flaw. 2 days later, a longer piece appeared in a publication she recognized. This one had quotes. Anonymous sources described Claire as calculating, cold, financially motivated. One source allegedly close to the Sterling family claimed she had discussed the divorce settlement strategy with friends before the marriage had even shown signs of strain. She hadn't. But the piece ran anyway. On the 4th day, a website published photographs from her honeymoon, photographs that had lived on Davis's private cloud backup, photographs she had not given anyone permission to distribute. They weren't explicit, nothing that crossed a legal threshold the Sterling attorneys couldn't navigate around. But they were intimate, and seeing them laid out for public consumption in a slideshow format with advertising between the frames was a specific kind of violation that didn't have a clean word for it. She sat with her phone in her hands in her hotel room and scrolled through the comments and then stopped scrolling because there is a point at which continuing to read what strangers think of you starts to feel less like information and more like self-harm. Her phone had 47 missed calls by the end of that day. 11 were from journalists. 4 were from former colleagues checking in with the specific warmth of people who want proximity to chaos. 3 were from friends, real friends, or what she thought were real friends, who left messages that were sympathetic in tone and kept mentioning that they'd been getting questions about her and wondered if she had a plan for handling things. 2 days after that, she got a call from her employer. She'd been working as a senior communications director for a nonprofit focused on education access. She was good at it. She'd been good at it for 14 months. The executive director called her on a Tuesday morning and used phrases like extremely difficult circumstances and protecting the organization's positioning, and we're so sorry to do this, and in the end what it meant was that she didn't have a job anymore. She said she understood. She thanked him. She hung up and sat on the edge of the hotel bed and pressed both palms against her knees and breathed. Then she called her landlord about the apartment she'd been renting while the hotel stay was supposed to be temporary. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. The lease would not be renewed. He was sorry. He had a family business to consider. She didn't blame him. That was the thing. She couldn't even blame him cleanly. Because whatever was being done to her was being done at a scale and a coordination level that a landlord in Queens couldn't resist even if he wanted to. By the end of the second week, the mainstream media had picked up the story. Not as a divorce story anymore, as a fraud story, as a character story. The framing had evolved. The way carefully managed narratives evolve when someone with resources is steering them. And now Claire Bennett wasn't just a difficult ex-wife. She was a pattern. She was someone who had entered the Sterling family under false pretenses. Someone who had cultivated relationships for access. Someone who had allegedly copied confidential corporate documents during her time consulting for Sterling Industries 3 years before they were even married. That one almost broke her. Not because the accusation was new. It wasn't. It had appeared in one of the earlier pieces as a vague implication, but because the specificity had increased. Document numbers, project names, a timeline that had been constructed with enough accuracy about real events that it would take a lawyer and a forensic accountant to untangle the fabrications from the facts. She called Tom Decker. He told her he was doing everything he could and that she should avoid public statements. She asked him about the document allegations specifically. He told her to let him look into it and said he'd call her back. He called back the next evening and told her gently that given the escalating complexity of the situation, he thought she might need representation with more resources than his firm could currently provide. She understood what that meant, too. She spent that night sitting at the small desk by the hotel window, going through a yellow legal pad line by line, trying to account for every document she'd ever touched during her consulting period with Sterling Industries. She wasn't a lawyer. She didn't know what was relevant. She just knew that somewhere in the precise machinery of what was being done to her, there was a reason. Divorces happened. Public divorces happened. Public divorces that turned ugly happened even in families with every incentive to manage appearances. But this was something else. Margaret Sterling wasn't protecting her son's reputation or the family's dignity. She was burying something. Claire just didn't know what yet. She was still writing on the legal pad at 2 a.m. when her phone buzzed with a message from a number she didn't recognize. Don't talk to the press. Don't check into anywhere under your real name. There's a meeting tomorrow between Voss and someone from the DA's office. You need a better attorney than Tom Decker. She stared at the message for a long time. Then she typed back, "Who is this?" No response came that night, but the next morning her phone rang. A woman's voice, crisp and professional, identified herself as a partner at a firm Claire had heard of, the kind of firm whose name appeared in major federal cases and whose address was on a floor where regular people didn't typically end up. "Ms. Bennett," the woman said, "my name is Catherine Reeves. I've been asked to represent you. All fees have already been arranged." "By who?" Claire asked. A brief pause. "An interested party," Catherine said. "Who would like to remain anonymous for now?" Claire looked at the legal pad on the desk, at the hotel room around her, at the window and the city outside it, gray and indifferent and enormous. "Why?" she asked. "Because," Catherine said, "someone believes you're telling the truth, and because someone with resources has decided that matters." Claire didn't say yes immediately. She wasn't the kind of person who said yes to things immediately. That impulse had been trained out of her, carefully and over years, by a marriage to a family that treated deliberation as weakness and then turned around and used your impulsiveness against you when you finally showed it. She asked for 24 hours. Catherine gave her 18. And in those 18 hours, as another wave of fabricated stories hit the media cycle, and a former Sterling Industries PR consultant gave an on-camera interview describing Claire as the most calculating person she had ever encountered, a woman she had met exactly twice at events where they had exchanged fewer than 40 words combined, Claire Bennett sat with the yellow legal pad and made a list. Not of her options. Of everything she had seen, heard, touched, and been handed during 5 years inside one of New York's most powerful families. The list was longer than she expected, and somewhere near the bottom, in handwriting slightly less controlled than the rest, she wrote down the name of a pharmaceutical company she'd heard referenced once in a closed meeting she had accidentally walked in on, 3 years before the marriage fell apart. She'd thought nothing of it at the time. Sitting alone in a hotel room with an anonymous attorney offer and an unknown protector in a life that had been systematically dismantled over 19 days, she thought about it now. She circled the name twice. Then she called Catherine Reeves back and said she was in. Catherine Reeves's office didn't look like a place where people came to be saved. It looked like a place where people came to be assessed. The furniture was expensive but not ostentatious, the kind of restraint that costs more than showing off. A single painting on the wall, abstract dark blues and grays. A desk with nothing on it except a legal pad, a pen, and a file folder that Claire recognized as her own case before she even sat down. Catherine herself was somewhere in her mid-50s, compact, with close-cropped natural hair and reading glasses she wore pushed up on her forehead like a second set of eyes she hadn't decided to use yet. She poured 2 cups of coffee without asking. She slid one across the desk. "Talk me through the pharmaceutical name you wrote down," she said. No preamble. No warm-up. Claire wrapped both hands around the cup. "How do you know about that?" "Because you circled it twice, and the legal pad is sitting in your bag, and I can see the impression through the cover." Catherine's eyes were level, professional, entirely unimpressed. "Talk." So Claire talked. It had been 3 years before the divorce, 18 months before she and Davis were even engaged. She'd been consulting for Sterling Industries on a communications restructuring. Her firm had been hired to streamline how the company's subsidiaries handled press relations. She was working late on a Thursday, had taken a wrong turn looking for the copy room on the 14th floor, and had walked into a conference room she thought was empty. It wasn't. Davis was at the far end of the table. Gerald Voss was beside him. A third man she didn't recognize, heavy-set, red tie, the kind of tan that comes from places with better weather, was standing at a whiteboard with a series of figures written across it. Numbers with a lot of zeros. They all stopped talking the moment she opened the door. She apologized, backed out, found the copy room, and spent the following 20 minutes convincing herself she hadn't seen anything unusual. People had financial meetings. That was what boardrooms were for. She'd been tired. She hadn't been paying attention. Davis had called her that same evening. First time he'd ever called her personally, outside of a professional context. He'd been warm, self-deprecating, a little funny. He apologized for the awkward moment earlier, asked if she'd like to have dinner sometime to discuss the project progress outside the office. She'd said yes. 18 months later, they were married. 2.5 years after that, the marriage was over. Catherine was writing on her legal pad while Claire talked. Not taking notes exactly, more like drawing a timeline without explaining what she was doing. "The company name," Catherine said. "Veritex Pharmaceutical," Claire said. "It was on the whiteboard. I only caught it for a second." Catherine wrote it down, underlined it, didn't look up. "And you never saw it again?" "Once. In an email chain. I was pulled into a distribution list by mistake. It happened sometimes. The internal systems were badly organized. The email was about a regulatory review timeline. I was removed from the chain within about 10 minutes. Someone caught the error and corrected it." "You remember the date?" "Not exactly. Spring, approximately 14 months before Davis and I got divorced." Catherine tapped the pen against the pad 3 times. Then she looked up. There was a pharmaceutical acquisition completed by a Sterling Industries subsidiary in that time frame. Veritex was the target. The deal was structured as an asset purchase, and it closed quietly. No major press, regulatory filing buried in a quarterly report. She paused. The acquisition was approved by a regulatory body that had 2 political appointees on its review committee. Both of those appointees received substantial contributions to their affiliated PACs within 60 days of the approval. Claire set down the coffee cup. You already knew about this. I knew about the acquisition, Catherine said. I didn't know you had a connection to it. That changes the shape of things considerably. What does it mean? It means, Catherine said, folding her hands on the desk, that you may have inadvertently witnessed the earliest stages of a bribery arrangement, which means you may be, in a strictly legal sense, a witness whose testimony could unravel a transaction worth approximately $400 million and implicate at least 2 elected officials and 1 federal regulator. The room was very quiet. That's why they're doing this, Claire said. It wasn't a question. The answer had already arrived, whole and cold and clarifying, the way the truth sometimes does, not gradually, but all at once, like a light being switched on in a room you thought you knew in the dark. That would be my current hypothesis, Catherine said. The divorce, Claire said. The settlement. The NDA in the settlement would have effectively silenced you on anything related to your time at Sterling Industries, yes. And when I didn't sign, they needed another method. Claire pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a moment. Just a moment. Then she put her hand back in her lap. They're going to charge me, she said. They're building toward it, Catherine said. The document theft narrative in the press is groundwork. It's establishing public perception before a legal action so that when the action comes, it lands in already prepared soil. She said it the way doctors deliver diagnoses, not unkindly, but without softening the information into something it wasn't. We have time, not unlimited time, but time. How much? Weeks, Catherine said. Possibly less. Claire looked at the window. Midday Manhattan moved behind the glass, indifferent and enormous. Somewhere out there, in offices and courtrooms and newsrooms, people were constructing a version of her life that had no relationship to anything she'd actually done. And they were doing it with resources she couldn't match, and connections she couldn't reach, and a head start she couldn't close. Who's paying your fees? She said. Catherine picked up her pen again. That question is above my clearance on this matter. That's not an answer. No, Catherine agreed. It isn't. She flipped to a new page on the legal pad. What I can tell you is that the person who contacted my firm is not associated with any government agency, not associated with any media organization, not associated with anyone in the Sterling orbit, and has specifically instructed me that their identity should be disclosed only when you are ready to hear it. That's supposed to make me feel better? It's supposed to make you feel informed, Catherine said. Whether it makes you feel better is your own business. That night, Claire moved out of the hotel. Catherine had arranged a short-term furnished apartment in a building in Hell's Kitchen under a name that belonged to a Shell LLC, the firm used for client housing. The building had a doorman who had worked there for 19 years and a camera system that recorded the lobby, the elevator, and both stairwells. Claire carried 2 bags. That was all she had left that mattered in a portable sense: clothes, her laptop, the legal pad, and a hard drive with a decade of personal files she'd had the foresight to back up before the hotel became untenable. She didn't sleep well. The anonymous texts had continued, sporadic, factual, always from the same number that traced to a prepaid device when she'd tried, briefly, uselessly, to look it up. The messages arrived in the early mornings, usually between 5 and 6, and they contained specific information that had no business being specific. Times, locations, names. Voss meets with the DA's deputy at 11 a.m. Friday. The restaurant is private. The agenda is you. Helena Sterling called 3 journalists this week. She's pushing the financial fraud angle. She's the one who provided the honeymoon photographs. That last one had surprised her. Not Davis. Not Margaret. Helena, who had always seemed merely indifferent, it turned out had been actively contributing. Claire sat with that for an hour one morning, turning it over. She'd never done anything to Helena. She'd barely known her. And Helena had spent, months? Collecting ammunition for a war Claire hadn't known she was in. People could hold grudges for things you'd never done to them. She knew that. She just hadn't encountered it operating at this scale before. The charity event happened 3 weeks after she moved into the Hell's Kitchen apartment. Catherine had suggested it, which had surprised her. It was a fundraiser for an international literacy foundation at a midtown hotel, the kind of event where tickets cost $2,000 and the silent auction items started at 5 figures. Catherine had acquired an invitation through a colleague and told Claire plainly that it would be good for her to be seen in public looking like someone who had not been destroyed. "I can barely afford my dry cleaning right now," Claire said. "The dress is handled," Catherine said. "Show up, drink water, speak to no one about the case. If anyone asks about the divorce, you have no comment that you haven't already made. And if someone starts filming me, then hold your head up straight and give them nothing useful." Claire went. She did not truthfully expect anything from the evening except discomfort and the exercise of endurance. She wore a navy dress that fit correctly and heels she remembered how to walk in, and she stood in that ballroom with a glass of sparkling water and watched the city's philanthropically motivated wealthy interact with each other and told herself to breathe and look present. She was 40 minutes into this exercise when a man appeared at her left. He didn't announce himself. He simply arrived, the way large men in expensive suits sometimes do in crowded rooms, without urgency, without apology, as if the space had always been arranged for them. He was somewhere in his mid to late 40s, dark hair going silver at the temples, and he had the kind of face that had been handsome when it was younger, and had since become something more interesting than handsome. He looked at the auction item in front of them, a framed photograph of the Tuscan countryside, and said, without looking at her, "It's a good photograph. The price is wrong." "Too high?" Claire said. "Too low," he said. "Whoever set the opening bid didn't know what they had." He turned then and held out his hand. "Vincent," he said, "first name only." "Claire," she said. His grip was brief and unhurried. His eyes were dark and entirely still in a way that reminded her, oddly, of Catherine Reeves, the quality of someone who had decided long ago not to let their face make promises their plans didn't intend to keep. He did not mention the sterling name. He did not mention the divorce, the media, the stories. He asked her whether she'd been to Tuscany. She said once, years ago. He said he preferred the northern coast but understood the appeal of the hill towns. She said she'd only had 4 days, which wasn't enough for anything. He said most things worth understanding couldn't be absorbed in 4 days. It was not a remarkable conversation. It was not designed to be remarkable. What it was, in an evening full of people who either avoided her entirely or spoke to her with the careful neutrality of someone managing their proximity to a controversy, was simply normal. He spoke to her the way you speak to someone you have no opinion about yet. As a person, first, without the asterisk of everything that had been written about her preceding her into every room she entered. They stood together for perhaps 20 minutes. He excused himself before she could find a reason to ask his last name, nodded once, and moved across the room toward a group of older men who straightened slightly when he approached. She filed it away as an unremarkable kindness from a stranger. She found out who he was the following morning. Catherine called at 7:45 before Claire had finished her first cup of coffee and said, "I'm told you spoke with someone at the event last night. Dark hair, late 40s, introduced himself as Vincent." Claire set down the cup. "For about 20 minutes. How do you know that?" "Because I have a client whose name occasionally generates calls to my office from various sources," Catherine said. Her voice was careful in a way it hadn't been before. "His full name is Vincent Moretti." Claire knew the name. Most people in New York knew the name in the same way they knew the names of things that existed at the edge of what was visible, present in conversation, referenced in articles that were careful about what they proved, associated with a category of power that didn't announce itself through press releases or shareholder meetings. She started. "Yes," Catherine said, "and he was at a literacy fundraiser." "He donates to approximately 12 charitable foundations annually," Catherine said. "All legitimate, all verifiable." "Catherine," Claire gripped the phone, "is he the one paying your fees?" A pause that lasted exactly long enough to be the answer. "I'm not in a position, is it him?" Another pause. "I would encourage you," Catherine said carefully, "not to make any decisions about this until you've had time to think." Claire stood at the window of the apartment in Hell's Kitchen and looked at the street below and thought about the man who had stood next to her at a silent auction talking about Tuscany, and not once mentioned any of the things that had been weaponized against her in national media. She thought about the texts that had warned her, with specific operational accuracy, about private meetings between her enemies and people with legal authority. She thought about an attorney she couldn't have afforded, appearing with fees already settled by someone who wanted to remain unnamed. She thought about the name Moretti and what it meant in a city like this one. And then she thought about something else, something older than all of it. 3 years ago, on a night in late October, she had been walking home from the subway through a block she didn't usually take, a shortcut she'd used twice and was testing again. She'd heard something from a narrow alley between two buildings, not a sound she could immediately name, just a sound that was wrong for the space. Most people would have kept walking. Claire had stopped. She'd stood at the alley entrance and looked in. There was a man on the ground. He was on his side, one arm beneath him, the other extended. He was bleeding. She could see it even in the low light, the dark stain spreading across his shirt. He was conscious, but barely. There was no one else in the alley. She went in. She didn't think about it the way people in movies think about things. She didn't stand there calculating risk. She just went in because a person was on the ground and she was someone who went toward problems that needed solving. She called an emergency line immediately. She knelt beside him. He looked up at her with eyes that were present and focused despite everything wrong with his body, and he said, in a voice that was controlled in a way that surprised her, "Don't stay." She stayed. She pressed her scarf against the wound. She talked to him. About nothing. About the temperature. About the fact that she could already hear the sirens coming. She paid the first responder's on-site fee with her own card when the ambulance arrived, before she'd thought about whether she should or could afford it. She gave her name to no one. She didn't wait to see what happened next. She just left. She had never told anyone that story. She had never told Davis. She'd come home that night, washed her hands twice, put the ruined scarf in the trash, and not mentioned it because it felt private in a way she couldn't fully explain, like something that belonged only to the moment it had happened. Now, standing at a window in a borrowed apartment with a coffee going cold behind her, she understood what she had been to Vincent Moretti for the last 3 years. A name he'd found somehow, a face he'd remembered, a debt he apparently intended to repay. Her phone buzzed. Not Catherine this time. The prepaid number. "There's a meeting tonight. Margaret Sterling and 2 men from the DA's office. We have the address and we have the room. You should know what they're planning before they execute it. Are you ready to talk to the person who's been sending these messages?" She read it twice. Then she typed, "Where?" The response came in under a minute. "Central Park. The bench by the Conservatory Garden North Gate. 8 o'clock. Come alone. If you bring anyone, I'll know, and I won't be there." She showed the message to Catherine, who read it twice and told her flatly that she should not go. "They know things that only someone with serious resources would know," Claire said. "The meeting times, the room numbers, Helena's involvement. Someone has been protecting me for weeks and they haven't asked for anything." "Not yet," Catherine said. "I'm going." "Claire, I'm going," she said again. Catherine stood very still for a moment. Then she said, "I want you back in contact by 9 o'clock. If I don't hear from you by 9, I make calls." "Fine. And I want you to understand," Catherine said, "that knowing who this person is changes your position legally, relationally, and in terms of risk. Once you know, you can't unknow. And if you end up in a courtroom, what you know will matter." "I know what I'm walking into," Claire said. She didn't. Not fully. But she was going anyway. The evening was cold. The park at 8 o'clock had the particular quality of a city partially put away. Joggers, dog walkers, the far sound of traffic, the trees holding the last of October in their branches. She found the bench. She sat down. She waited. He arrived from the north path, alone, hands in the pockets of a dark coat, and he sat on the bench with the ease of someone who had arranged 1,000 things in 1,000 difficult situations and had simply arrived at the next one. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "The alley, 3 years ago, you stayed." She looked at him. At the face she'd half remembered in the dark that night, now clear and lit by a lamp 20 feet away. You were the man on the ground, she said. Yes. The word landed between them like something dropped from a significant height. She looked straight ahead at the dark garden. Breathed. Let the information settle into its proper position. And you've been... She stopped. Started again. For 3 years. Yes. She turned and looked at him directly. Why didn't you just tell me? Because, he said, there was nothing to tell. Until there was. He reached into his coat and placed a slim folder on the bench between them. She looked at it. Open it, he said. She did. Inside were printed documents, financial records, wire transfers, emails between Gerald Voss and a deputy in the district attorney's office, scheduling communications between Margaret Sterling and a senior political operative she recognized from news coverage. And at the back, a single page with a name and a number. Veritex Pharmaceutical, and a transaction amount that ran to 9 figures. How did you get these? She said. That's not the important question right now, he said. It's an important question to me. I know. He looked at her. I'll answer it. Just not tonight. She closed the folder, held it against her chest, felt the weight of what was inside it. Not the paper weight, the other kind. The kind that comes from holding something that could change the direction of everything if it went the right way, and destroy you entirely if it went wrong. What do you want from me? She said. He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive quiet. Thinking quiet. The distinction mattered. Nothing that costs you anything you haven't already decided to spend, he said finally. She looked at the folder, at the dark garden beyond the gate, at the city sitting enormous and lit beyond the tree line. She thought about the hotel room and the yellow legal pad and the circled name, and every morning for the past 6 weeks that she'd woken up not knowing whether the day would bring a subpoena or an arrest or simply another story she'd have to read about herself and survive. She thought about a man on the ground in an October alley who had told her not to stay and been wrong about whether she would. Tell me everything, she said. And Vincent Moretti, for the first time in 3 years of watching from a distance, began to... Vincent talked for 2 hours. He didn't pace. He didn't gesture dramatically. He sat on that bench with his hands loosely clasped between his knees, and he talked the way people talk when they've been holding something for a long time and have finally found the right room to put it down in. Steady, deliberate, with the particular exhaustion of someone who had been carrying weight so long they'd forgotten what it felt like not to. He told her about the ambush. 4 men, a debt dispute between 2 organizations that had been mismanaged by someone 2 levels below him, a miscommunication that put him in the wrong location at the wrong time without adequate cover. He'd taken 2 rounds, one through his side, one that had grazed his shoulder but done more structural damage than a graze had any right to do. He'd made it to the alley. He'd expected to wait it out alone. Then a woman in a gray coat had appeared at the alley entrance and looked in. He told her about the weeks in recovery afterward, about the people he'd had find her name, not to contact her, not to leverage her, simply to know it. Claire Bennett, communications consultant. Billings, Montana originally. New York for 6 years. He'd learned the basic shape of her life, and then, when she'd entered Davis Sterling's orbit in a way that didn't seem like accident to anyone paying attention, he'd watched more carefully. He told her he'd known about Veritex before she'd mentioned it to Catherine. He told her he'd known about the acquisition, the bribery structure, the 2 political appointees, and the federal regulator for almost 18 months. His organization's financial intelligence had flagged the transaction as part of routine monitoring of certain connected industries. He hadn't acted on it because it wasn't his fight, and the people involved hadn't crossed any lines that were his to enforce. Then the divorce happened. Then the campaign against Claire happened, and the calculation changed. Claire listened to all of it without interrupting. The park was quieter now. It was past 9, the dog walkers gone, just the sound of distant traffic and the wind moving through the last of the October leaves. She sat with the folder in her lap and her hands folded on top of it, and her face doing the thing it did when she was processing something large, which was almost nothing at all. Just a slight tension around the eyes, a quality of stillness that people who didn't know her might mistake for calm. You said you'll tell me what you want, she said when he finished. Tell me. I want to give you what's in that folder and whatever else we've collected, he said, and I want to help you use it. In exchange for what? Nothing. She looked at him. That's not how this works, she said. Nobody gives you an attorney and 6 weeks of intelligence and a folder full of evidence and wants nothing. I want the people who are using government resources to destroy a private citizen to be held accountable, he said. That's not nothing, but it's not something that costs you anything. It costs me association with you, she said. The words were direct, not cruel. She meant them as a fact, not an insult. If anyone finds out who's behind this help, every piece of that evidence becomes tainted. Every case Catherine builds gets undermined. They'll say you fabricated it. They'll say I made a deal with organized crime to escape the consequences of things I actually did. Vincent was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. So how does this work? Carefully, he said. She almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was the most compressed and accurate description of an impossible situation she'd heard in 6 weeks of impossible situations. She took the folder home. She gave it to Catherine the next morning. Catherine spent 4 hours going through it, made 12 phone calls Claire wasn't in the room for, and then came back and sat across from Claire at the kitchen table and said, "This is real. The financial records are authentic. The emails are traceable. The wire transfers line up with publicly available PAC filings in a way that would take a forensic accountant approximately 3 days to confirm." "Can we use it?" "Not directly," Catherine said. "Not yet. The provenance is the problem. If this goes to a courtroom and someone asks where it came from, we have to have an answer that doesn't end with a federal jury spending 40 minutes deciding whether you and Vincent Moretti conspired to fabricate a fraud case against the Sterling family." "So what do we do with it?" "We use it as a map," Catherine said. "We already know where to look. Now we look through proper channels, and we find the same information ourselves through means that don't require explaining Vincent Moretti." It sounded reasonable. It sounded like a plan. Claire nodded and said they should start immediately. What neither of them knew was that the timeline had already changed. She found out on a Tuesday. It was 4.5 weeks after the Central Park meeting. Catherine had made significant progress. A financial journalist she trusted had independently confirmed portions of the Veritex acquisition structure through public filings, and a former Sterling Industries compliance officer had agreed to speak to an attorney under confidentiality terms. The case was building. Not fast enough, but building. Claire had settled into something resembling a routine in the Hell's Kitchen apartment. She woke early, worked through the morning on a careful reconstruction of every interaction she'd had with Sterling Industries documents during her consulting period, ate lunch standing at the kitchen counter because sitting down for lunch still felt like a luxury she hadn't earned back yet, and spent the afternoons on the phone with Catherine or going through files. She'd seen Vincent twice more since the park. Brief meetings, both times at a private location his people arranged. She'd stopped being nervous in his presence somewhere around the second meeting, which surprised her. He didn't perform. He didn't try to make her comfortable in a way that drew attention to the effort. He simply showed up and was direct about what he knew and what he didn't and what he thought. And she found it. In the context of 6 weeks of people performing positions at her, almost shockingly restful. She was aware this was complicated. She was aware that restful was not a word with any legal standing. She kept that particular awareness in a room by itself. The Tuesday she found out began normally. Catherine called at 8:30 with a question about a specific email date. Claire answered it. She made coffee. She opened her laptop. The arrest warrant story broke at 9:17. Not a warrant, the warrant. Her name, the charges: federal wire fraud, corporate espionage, theft of proprietary financial data, running across the bottom of every news feed simultaneously in the specific way that indicated coordinated release. Not a leak. A drop. Timed, distributed, managed. She read the headline 3 times. Her phone started ringing immediately. She let it ring. She read the actual text of the reported charges, which were specific and detailed and which described a version of her professional history that was so precisely inverted from what had actually happened that it had the quality of a negative photograph. Everything in the right place, all the light and dark reversed. Catherine arrived at the apartment 40 minutes later, which was faster than should have been possible given traffic, and Claire understood from the speed that Catherine had known this was coming before the news broke. "They moved it up," Catherine said, dropping her bag on the table. We had intelligence suggesting they'd file in 30 days. They filed this morning. How long have you known something was coming? Since yesterday afternoon. I was trying to confirm before I told you. Claire looked at her. That's not... You should have told me yesterday. I know, Catherine said. And she said it plainly, without the defensive layering that a lot of people applied to admissions like that, which meant Claire couldn't sustain the anger in the same way she might have. She sat down. What happens now? She said. You don't get arrested today, Catherine said. I'm filing a response this afternoon that will delay any enforcement action. We have time, but Claire... She paused, set both hands flat on the table. The timeline for the Veritex evidence just compressed severely. If this goes to arraignment before we have independent confirmation of the financial records, we're fighting a federal fraud case with a narrative and a map, but no verified ammunition. How long do we need? 2 weeks minimum, preferably 4. How long do we have? Catherine looked at her for a moment. 10 days, she said. Maybe 12. Claire pressed her fingers against the bridge of her nose. Breathed in, breathed out. I need to talk to Vincent, she said. Claire, I need to talk to him today. The meeting happened that evening in a building in Tribeca that appeared from the outside to be a private members club. From the inside, it was spare and clean and had the feeling of a place that handled a great deal of serious business without recording any of it. Vincent was already there when she arrived. 2 men she didn't know stood near the entrance and didn't look at her in the way that meant they were looking at everything. She sat across from him and put her phone face down on the table between them. They filed this morning, she said. I know. Your intelligence said 30 days. It did. He was watching her with that quality of stillness she'd stopped trying to read past. They changed the plan. Something moved faster than we anticipated. What moved faster? He was quiet for a beat. Then, the compliance officer Catherine was talking to, he made a call he shouldn't have made. The floor of the room seemed to shift slightly under her. He told them, she said. He told someone. We don't know the full chain yet. She sat very still. Understood what she was hearing. The compliance officer, the man Catherine had found through a journalist contact who had agreed to speak in confidence, whose participation was supposed to be the independent confirmation that made the Veritex evidence usable in court, had reported back to the Sterling orbit. He was a plant, she said. Possibly a plant from the beginning. Possibly someone who got scared when things became real. It doesn't change the outcome. It changes everything, she said. Catherine has been talking to him for 3 weeks. He knows our timeline. He knows what we're building. He knows which documents we've found and which ones we're still looking for. Yes, Vincent said. She stood up. She didn't pace. She walked to the window and stood there with her arms crossed and looked at the street below, which was wet from rain that had started and stopped while she was inside. She could see her own reflection in the glass. She looked like someone who had been running for 6 weeks and had just been told the finish line had moved. The federal charges, she said. Are they going to stick? Depends on the judge, Vincent said behind her. Depends on what evidence they produce and how their witnesses perform, and whether Catherine can get the case moved out of a favorable jurisdiction in time. That's not an answer. No, he said. It's a situation. She turned around. I need you to tell me what you actually think. He looked at her for a moment. There was something careful in it, not evasive, not calculating. More like someone who was choosing whether to put something heavy on a table they weren't certain could hold it. I think, he said, that if this goes to trial on their terms, with their timeline, with their witnesses and their narrative already established in public, the outcome is not good. She heard it, let it land. Then we can't let it go to trial on their terms, she said. No. So we need to change the terms. Yes. She came back to the table and sat down. The phone between them was face down and silent. The 2 men by the entrance were still not looking at her. What do you have that we haven't used yet? She said. Vincent reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed a small drive on the table. Matte black, the size of a thumb. Audiosum, he said. Recordings. 3 conversations involving Margaret Sterling, Gerald Voss, and 2 members of the DA's staff. The most recent one was 4 days ago. Claire looked at the drive. How were they obtained? She said. In ways that can't be used in court, he said. But they can be used to find things that can, she said. If we know what to look for and where to look, yes, Catherine would need to retrace the path through legal means. We don't have enough time for that. No, he said. We'd need another option. She looked at him. He looked back at her. The particular quality of the silence between them was one she was starting to recognize. It was the silence of two people who have both arrived at the same conclusion and are deciding whether to say it out loud. There's a gala, she said. He didn't blink. In 3 weeks, she said. The annual Sterling Foundation charity event. Davis will be there. Margaret will be there. Half the political establishment they've been working with will be there. Press, cameras, live coverage. Yes, he said. If we're going to change the terms, she said, we don't do it in a courtroom. We do it in a room where everyone who needs to be accountable is already standing together and the people who need to witness it have cameras. The idea was not fully formed. It had rough edges and no clear mechanism, and approximately 47 ways it could fail catastrophically. She was aware of all of this. She said it anyway because the alternative was a federal courtroom in 8 days with a compromised witness list and a public narrative that had been running for 2 months and a jury pool that had already read every piece of the story that had been written against her. She wasn't afraid of Vincent Moretti. That was the thing she'd understood somewhere between the park and this room that she couldn't have predicted. She wasn't afraid of him. She was afraid of what happened to her if she did nothing. The problem, Catherine said the next morning, when Claire laid it out for her, is that a public confrontation at a charity gala, orchestrated by a woman facing federal fraud charges and backed by a man whose organization is under ongoing federal monitoring, will be characterized as a stunt, as desperation, as exactly the kind of reckless behavior they've been attributing to you. Unless the evidence is too specific and too documented to be dismissed, Claire said, evidence has to be admissible to matter in court. I'm not talking about court, Claire said. I'm talking about the room, the people in that room, the cameras, the senators and the CEOs, and the journalists who have been running their version of this story because they only had one version. What happens when they're standing in a room and a second version plays on the screens? Catherine looked at her. What recordings? She said carefully. Catherine. Claire. What recordings? She held Catherine's gaze. Hypothetically, she said, if recordings existed, of Margaret Sterling and Gerald Voss and 2 members of the DA's staff discussing how to fabricate evidence against a private citizen, discussing specifically how to construct the document theft narrative, discussing the timeline for the federal charges and how to ensure the jurisdiction was favorable. If those recordings existed, not as court evidence, but as content that could play on a screen in front of 400 people with cameras, what happens? Catherine sat back in her chair. She put her reading glasses on her forehead. She looked at the ceiling briefly. The problem with that, she said, is the chain of custody. Where did they come from? How were they obtained? The moment someone in that room asks, everyone in that room will be filming with their phones, Claire said. The moment it plays, it goes everywhere. And once it's everywhere, a courtroom argument about chain of custody is a legal footnote to a story that's already been seen by 30 million people. That is, Catherine said slowly, an extremely dangerous line of reasoning. No. If it goes wrong, I know. If they can prove the recordings were obtained illegally, they use it to reinforce every criminal narrative they've built about you. I know. Claire kept her voice level. And if we do nothing, I go to trial in 8 days with a contaminated witness and a public record that says I'm a fraud. And the people who built all of that never face a single consequence. Catherine took her glasses off her forehead and set them on the desk. I need to think, she said. Think fast, Claire said. We have a week. The next 3 days were the kind of days that seem, afterward, to compress in memory. Too many calls, too many decisions made in insufficient time, too many moments of almost certainty followed by the cold return of doubt. Catherine worked the legal angles. Vincent's people worked on logistics. Claire worked on herself, which was the hardest project. She was sitting at the kitchen table on the 3rd evening when her phone rang. Number she didn't recognize, not the prepaid number, a different one. She answered, "Ms. Bennett?" A man's voice, measured, unhurried. "My name isn't important. What's important is that I work for people who are aware of what you're planning." Her hand tightened on the phone. "I'm not planning anything." "Ms. Bennett," the voice said, "please don't do that. It wastes both our time and we don't have a lot of it." A pause. "There's an offer. Withdraw the Catherine Reeves engagement. Accept a modified version of the original settlement. We've revised it upward significantly. The number is now closer to 6 million. Sign an NDA covering your Sterling Industries consulting period and leave New York." "Or," she said. "Or the federal case proceeds," the voice said. "And we add charges. We have a witness who will testify that you removed documents from Sterling Industries in a bag on the 14th of March 3 years ago. We have a second witness who will testify you discussed using those documents for personal financial gain. These witnesses are prepared and credentialed, and their testimony will be, fabricated," she said. "Persuasive," the voice said, "which, in a courtroom, matters more." She didn't say anything for a moment. "How long do I have to decide?" she said. 48 hours, the voice said. "Ms. Bennett, you should understand that the people on this side of the conversation are not people who make offers twice." The line went dead. She set the phone on the table, looked at it. The kitchen was quiet. The building around her was quiet. Outside, New York ran its machinery without pause or concern for what was happening on the 4th floor of an unremarkable building in Hell's Kitchen. She called Vincent. He answered on the second ring. "They just called me," she said. A pause. "What did they say?" he said. She told him, all of it, the revised settlement, the NDA, the new witnesses, the 48-hour window. She told him without emotion in her voice because she had put the emotion somewhere else temporarily and she could collect it later. When she finished, Vincent was quiet for a moment. "They don't offer twice," he said. "That's what they said." "They're right," he said. "They won't." "So we have 48 hours, she said. "Yes." "Are you still in?" she said. The pause that followed was brief. "I was never not in," he said. She closed her eyes, opened them. "Then we need to move the gala plan forward," she said. "We need everything ready. The recordings, the financial documents, the emails, the PAC filings, everything in a format that can be displayed and that speaks for itself in 30 seconds because that's all the time we'll have before someone tries to shut it down." "I know," he said. "And Vincent." She stopped, started again. "If this goes wrong, if they arrest me in that room, if they manage to contain it." "They won't," he said. "If they do," she said. "I need to know you won't." "Claire." His voice was quiet, but it had a quality to it that she'd only heard a few times, a quality that was not a performance. "I was in an alley 3 years ago, and I told you not to stay. You stayed anyway. You don't need to ask me that question." She breathed. "Okay," she said. She hung up. She sat at the table in the quiet apartment and placed both palms flat on the surface and pressed down, feeling the grain of the wood through her hands. She thought about the woman who had walked into a Sterling Industries conference room 12 days before her consulting contract ended and seen a number on a whiteboard and thought nothing of it. She thought about every accommodation she'd made, every instinct she'd suppressed, every room she'd shrunk herself to fit correctly into over 5 years of a marriage to a family that had never once adjusted itself 1 degree in her direction. She thought about what the voice on the phone had said. Persuasive. Which, in a courtroom, matters more. She thought about 48 hours and what it meant to let them expire. She took out the yellow legal pad. She turned to a clean page, and at the top of it, in handwriting that was steadier than she felt, she wrote 3 words. No more accommodating. Then she began to write down everything she remembered about the 14th of March 3 years ago. Every person she'd seen, every room she'd been in, every document she'd touched and what it contained and where she'd found it. Because the witnesses they were building against her were fabrications. But fabrications needed gaps to live in, and she intended to. She filled 11 pages before dawn, not in any organized way, not with headers or bullet points or the kind of clean, logical structure that might hold up in a brief. Just everything she could remember, in the order it came. Names, times, room numbers, the color of folders, who handed her what, which floor, which system, which password she'd used to access which shared drive during the 14 months of her consulting contract. She wrote until her hand cramped, and then she switched hands and kept going, and somewhere around 4 in the morning she understood something she hadn't expected to understand. She had been inside Sterling Industries for over a year. She had been thorough at her job in the way that people from places like Billings, Montana are thorough. Not because anyone is watching, but because half-done work feels worse than not starting. She had documented everything. She had backed up everything. She had sent herself summary emails at the close of every major project phase, a habit her first supervisor out of college had drilled into her because people forget and calendars lie, and the only protection against someone saying that's not what we agreed is a time-stamped record of what you actually did. Those emails still existed. 14 months of them, sitting in a personal email account she hadn't touched in 3 years, on a server that archived everything and deleted nothing, under a password she'd written in the back of a notebook she still had because she was the kind of person who kept notebooks. She called Catherine at 6:47 in the morning. "I have documentation," she said. 14 months of it. Self-sent project summaries, time-stamped, with document references. Every file I touched during the consulting period. Every deliverable. Every handoff. The witnesses they're building. Their testimony has to place me accessing documents that aren't on this list, or accessing documents on this list for purposes outside their stated scope. Either way, I have a counter record. Catherine was quiet for a moment. Claire could hear her moving, the sound of a chair, papers. "Send me access," Catherine said. "Right now. Everything." She did. The 48-hour window expired without Claire accepting the offer. No one called back. No one sent a message. The silence on the other side was absolute and deliberate, and she understood it for what it was. The sound of a door being closed and locked from the outside. There were no more offers. There was no more negotiation. What happened next was the gala, or it was a federal courtroom, and the difference between those two outcomes was the next 11 days. Vincent moved her the following morning. She didn't have much notice. A call at 7, a car at 7:40, 2 men she'd seen before and whose names she'd been told and immediately tested her ability to remember, Marco, and a younger one called Dante, who had the specific quality of watchfulness that comes from training rather than temperament. The apartment in Hell's Kitchen was finished. The new location was a penthouse in a building in Midtown whose lobby had more security infrastructure than most small airports and whose elevator required a code that changed every 24 hours. The apartment was larger than anything she'd lived in during her marriage. She registered this and filed it without dwelling on it. 3 other people were already working there when she arrived. A woman named Sue, who managed logistics and spoke in clipped sentences that contained no unnecessary words, and 2 men at laptops whose names she wasn't given and didn't ask for. The living room had been converted into something between a war room and a production studio. Screens on 2 walls, a printer running almost continuously, whiteboards covered in timelines. Catherine arrived an hour later, took one look at the room, and said nothing about it. She sat up at the dining table and opened her laptop and got to work. The 11 days were the most concentrated period of Claire's adult life. She slept in 4 to 5 hour increments and ate meals that appeared on the kitchen counter at irregular intervals, and spent the hours between on the phone, at the whiteboard, going through documents, reviewing the email archive with Catherine, and in 2 extended sessions with Vincent that were different from the others in a way she didn't examine directly. The recordings from the drive were transcribed. Catherine went through them with a forensic attention that Claire found almost painful to watch, pausing, rewinding, noting timestamps, cross-referencing statements against the documentary record they'd built. There was a recording from 11 days before the charges were filed in which Gerald Voss told a man whose voice matched the deputy DA's that the document theft narrative needed a living witness, not just paper, and that the compliance officer had confirmed the subject hasn't found the Veritex connection yet. There was a recording of Margaret Sterling discussing, in the flat, efficient tone of someone managing a household staff issue, how to ensure Claire's attorney was replaced before trial with someone less capable of creating problems. That one Claire listened to twice. Not because she needed to hear it twice, because the first time she heard it, she was listening for information, and the second time she was listening to understand something about the person who had orchestrated 5 years of her life from the outside. And what she understood on the second listen was that Margaret Sterling didn't hate her. Margaret Sterling didn't feel anything about her that rose to the level of hatred. She was a problem to be managed, like a contractor dispute or a supplier relationship that had soured. The complete absence of affect in the woman's voice when she discussed dismantling a human life was more disturbing than rage would have been. She told Vincent this on the seventh evening. They were standing at the window of the penthouse, the city spread out below them in its nighttime configuration, dense and luminous, and from this height, almost beautiful in the abstract way that things are beautiful when you're far enough from their details. "She doesn't think of me as a person," Claire said. "That's what makes it work. It's cleaner that way." "Yes," Vincent said. "Have you done that?" she said. "Thought of someone as a problem to be managed instead of a person?" He didn't answer immediately. She appreciated that he didn't answer immediately. "Yes," he said. "And now?" He looked at her. The city light caught the angles of his face in a way that showed how tired he was. Not the acute tiredness of a late night, but the deep background tiredness of someone who had been operating at high stakes for a very long time. "Not with you," he said. She looked back at the city. Something in her chest shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way that changed anything in the room, just a quiet internal rearrangement, like furniture settling. "We should sleep," she said. "Probably," he said. Neither of them moved for another 20 minutes. The gala was on a Saturday. The venue was the Grand Meridian Hotel on Fifth Avenue, a room that held 600 people at round tables and had a stage at one end with a full AV setup and a mezzanine level that ran 3 sides of the room and was typically used for overflow cocktail reception. The Sterling Foundation event had been held there for 9 consecutive years. The guest list was architecture. Senators, CEOs, 3 federal judges, 2 network news anchors, the deputy mayor, and approximately 40 members of what might loosely be called the city's permanent governing class, the people whose names appeared on institutional letterheads and whose influence didn't depend on election cycles. Vincent's people had been working the logistics for 9 days. Not the venue. The venue was the venue. They couldn't change that. The infrastructure. The AV system had a secondary input channel that had been dormant since the hotel's last renovation. It took a technician who had done legitimate work for the hotel for 6 years to reactivate it without triggering the system's event log. The mezzanine level had 4 hardwired connections that most of the hotel's own technical staff didn't know about. The projection system could receive from 3 sources simultaneously, and in the event of a primary source interruption, it defaulted to secondary without a visible gap. Sue explained all of this to Claire on the Thursday before the event, with the brisk clarity of someone describing a logistics chain for a product shipment. "What's the failure point?" Claire said. "Human," Sue said. "Always human. If someone on their side has been told to watch the AV system, they'll see the secondary input go live, and they'll cut it within 90 seconds. We have 1 shot." 90 seconds is enough, Catherine said from the table without looking up. "If the room is already watching," Sue said, "if people have their phones out, if the first 30 seconds are compelling enough that cutting the feed becomes its own story." "The first 30 seconds," Claire said, "are Margaret Sterling's voice talking about fabricating a witness." Sue considered this. "That'll do," she said. The night before the gala, Claire couldn't eat. She sat at the kitchen counter and moved food around a plate and thought about the specific texture of the next 18 hours and what could go wrong within them. The arrest warrant was still active. Catherine had successfully delayed enforcement but not vacated it, which meant that the moment she walked into that hotel, she was technically a wanted person in a room full of people, some of whom had signed off on making her that way. If something went wrong before the AV system activated, if security spotted her before she reached a position that made her visible enough to create a scene around, if the recordings were challenged fast enough, if the financial documents weren't legible on screen. If. Vincent came and sat beside her at the counter. He didn't say anything for a moment. He poured himself water from the pitcher, drank some, set the glass down. "Tell me what you're afraid of," he said. "Everything," she said. "Specifically." She put down her fork. "That it doesn't work and I get arrested in front of 400 people and the story becomes Unstable woman crashes charity gala, confirms everything her ex-mother-in-law said about her. She paused. That it works and they find another way. That it works and the cost is something I haven't thought of yet. That's not everything, he said. What else? She looked at the plate. That I've changed into someone I don't recognize, she said. That somewhere between the hotel room and the legal pad and the Tribeca meetings and this penthouse, I made decisions that the woman who walked into that conference room and refused $3.4 million wouldn't recognize. She said it quietly. She walked away from the money because she didn't want to be owned. And now You're fighting, Vincent said, with your tools. Yes. He met her eyes. That bother you? It should, maybe. Does it? She looked at him for a long moment. Ask me tomorrow, she said. He nodded. He didn't push. That was one of the things. She'd accumulated a small list of things, and this was on it. He didn't push when she needed to find her own footing. She went to sleep at 11. She was awake again at 2:30, then 4, then gave up at 5:15 and sat at the window with coffee until the city started to get light. The car arrived at 6 in the evening. She wore a dress Catherine had found, midnight blue, clean lines, the kind of thing that read as composed from a distance and cost about a tenth of what the average guest would be wearing. She'd done her own hair, her own makeup. She had looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for approximately 30 seconds, said nothing, and walked out. Vincent was waiting in the lobby. He wore a dark suit that fit the way expensive things fit when they're made specifically for a person, and he looked at her when she came off the elevator with an expression that was not quite what she expected. Not the focused assessment of someone checking the operational status of a component, but something quieter and less categorizable than that. Ready, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes, he said. The car moved through evening Manhattan. Nobody spoke much. Catherine was in a separate car that would arrive 8 minutes after theirs, present but not yet visible, carrying 2 physical copies of every document and a third set on a drive. Marco was driving. Dante was in the front passenger seat. 2 other cars were ahead of them, one behind. Claire watched the city move past the window and felt her heart doing something she was trying not to concentrate on. Not racing exactly, more like hitting every beat harder than usual, as if her body was registering the significance of the next 2 hours before her mind had finished processing it. The hotel came into view. Even from outside, through the car window, she could see the event was full. The red carpet at the entrance, the photographers, the guests arriving in a steady stream, the particular theatrical quality of a room full of powerful people enacting their public selves for each other. She saw a senator she recognized from news coverage, a network anchor whose face had been on screens for 2 decades, 3 men in a cluster near the entrance whose suits and posture said financial industry in a way that needed no caption. She saw Davis. He was standing near the entrance, talking to someone she didn't know, and he looked normal. That was the thing. He looked exactly like himself, which was a man in a very good suit at an event his family had run for 9 years, and the normalcy of it was briefly more disorienting than anything else about the evening. She'd spent weeks inside the wreckage of what he'd allowed to happen to her, and here he was, intact and social and taking a glass from a passing tray. Don't look at him, Vincent said. She hadn't realized she was still looking. Right, she said. The car stopped. Marco came around and opened the door. Vincent got out first and then turned and offered his hand, and she took it and stepped out onto the sidewalk, and the cold evening air hit her face, and she registered in that moment every camera that was already pointing in their direction because Vincent Moretti arriving at any event was news, and the woman arriving with him was about to become news of a different kind. The photographers caught it first. The murmur that moved through the cluster of press at the entrance, the reorientation of lenses. She heard her name from 2 different directions, questions called out that she didn't answer. She walked beside Vincent through the entrance and into the lobby and felt the shift in the room, the way you feel a temperature change, the way attention moves and redistributes, and the conversations near them lost half a beat before recovering. They were inside. The ballroom was everything the event had promised. 600 people in formal wear, the ambient roar of a room at full social operation, flowers and candlelight, and the specific lighting that made everyone look slightly more significant than they were. The screens at the front of the room were playing a looping visual presentation about the Sterling Foundation's charitable work. The stage was set for the evening's program: podium, microphone, the architecture of a formal presentation. Claire clocked the room in the first 90 seconds. The mezzanine above them. She could see the secondary input panel was in place, a small unit that looked from a distance like a standard house speaker. The main AV booth was at the back of the room, ground level, staffed by 2 technicians she didn't recognize. One of Vincent's people was already in position at the mezzanine, she knew, because Sue had confirmed it 40 minutes ago in a text that said simply, "Set." She saw Margaret Sterling across the room. The woman was at the center of a cluster near the stage, upright, composed, silver hair precise, working the room with the efficiency of someone who had been doing exactly this for 40 years. She hadn't seen Claire yet. Or if she hadn't shown it. 9 minutes, Vincent said quietly beside her. 9 minutes until the program started. Until the first speaker took the podium and the room's attention was drawn to the front and the secondary input went live. She nodded. Gerald Voss saw her first. He was coming from the bar with a drink in each hand, and he stopped walking so abruptly that the drink in his left hand sloshed. He stared at her for a full 2 seconds. Not with anger, not with fear exactly, but with the specific expression of a man who has been in control of a situation for months and has just seen a variable he hadn't modeled for. Then his eyes moved to Vincent, and the expression changed. She watched it happen, watched the legal calculation in his face run through its paces and arrive somewhere that looked like recalibration. He turned and moved back toward the cluster near the stage, and she saw him lean toward Margaret Sterling's ear. "She knows," Vincent said. "Yes," Claire said. 30 seconds faster then," he said. She pulled out her phone and typed a single word to Sue. "Now." The screens flickered. The looping foundation presentation stuttered, held, and was replaced. Not instantly, not cleanly, with the slight technical roughness of a secondary system overriding a primary, which somehow made it look more real rather than less. The first thing that appeared on both main screens and the 3 ancillary displays along the mezzanine railing was a waveform. An audio waveform. Playing. And then Margaret Sterling's voice came out of the ballroom speaker system, clear and unhurried and precise. "The document theft narrative needs a living witness. Paper alone creates reasonable doubt. We need someone who can testify to behavior. The timeline has to predate the divorce filing, or it reads as retaliation." A man's voice, slightly muffled. "The compliance officer has confirmed she hasn't found the Veritex connection." Margaret Sterling. "Good. Keep it that way. I need the warrant filed before her attorney can—" The room had gone very quiet very fast. 600 people, and the sound that replaced the ambient roar of a working crowd was not silence exactly. It was the specific acoustic quality of a large number of people all stopping what they were doing at the same moment. Glasses paused halfway to mouths. Sentences abandoned mid-word. Heads turning. Then the phones came out. Not 1 or 2. Dozens, within the first 20 seconds. The instinct of a generation that had learned to document before it had learned to process. Screens pointed at screens. The recordings being recorded. Margaret Sterling's face, across the room, was extraordinary in its stillness. Claire was watching it from 40 feet away, and she could see the precise moment the woman understood what was happening. Not the confusion of a first second, but the rapid arrival of comprehension in someone whose mind worked quickly. The stillness that followed comprehension, the assessment. Then Margaret made a move Claire hadn't anticipated. She walked toward the AV booth. Not running. Walking with purpose, the way she moved through every room she'd ever entered, as if forward motion was her birthright, and everything in her path would adjust accordingly. 2 of Vincent's people materialized from the crowd and positioned themselves between her and the booth with the fluid efficiency of people who had been placed precisely for this contingency. Margaret stopped. She looked at the 2 men. Then she looked across the room and found Vincent's face. And something passed across her expression that Claire had never seen on it before in 5 years of proximity. Something that was not, even now, fear, but was the closest thing to it that a person like Margaret Sterling could produce. Vincent met her gaze. He said nothing. He made no gesture. He simply stood beside Claire and looked at Margaret Sterling across a ballroom full of people holding up their phones, and let the silence and the recordings and the faces around them do the work. The audio continued. The financial records appeared next. Documents scrolling on the screens, wire transfers with amounts and dates and recipient accounts, the PAC filings with contribution dates highlighted, the regulatory approval timeline with the two political appointees' names visible, and the 60-day correlation between contributions and approvals laid out in a format that needed no explanation. Someone near the stage said, "Oh my God," loudly enough that Claire heard it clearly. A senator she recognized from 3 separate press photos with Margaret Sterling had already moved toward the exit. He didn't run. He walked fast, phone to his ear, the walk of a man who was already calling his attorney. Davis Sterling was standing near the center of the room, and he was not moving at all. He was looking at the screens with an expression that Claire, even now, even here, could not fully read. He looked like someone who had been told a story so many times that he'd forgotten there was another version, and the other version was now filling every screen in the room. Security arrived. 2 hotel security personnel came through a side door, followed by a man in plain clothes who had the posture of law enforcement, even in civilian clothes. Claire recognized the type. Her pulse went up. She felt it in her throat, in her hands. The man in plain clothes scanned the room and found her. He moved toward her. Vincent stepped forward slightly, not between them, just present, visible. The man stopped 3 feet from Claire and said, in a voice calibrated for just the 2 of them, "Ms. Bennett, I need to ask you to come with me." "On what basis?" Catherine said. She had appeared beside Claire, seemingly from nowhere, already speaking. "My client is a guest at this event. If you're here to execute an arrest warrant, I will need to see your credentials, the warrant documentation, and I will be filing an immediate emergency motion challenging the warrant's validity given evidence of prosecutorial misconduct currently being made available to approximately—" She glanced around the room at the phones. "Several hundred witnesses." The man looked at her, then at the screens, then back at Claire. He said nothing for a moment. His own phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at it. His expression shifted. A small shift, just around the eyes. The kind of shift that happens when the information you're receiving changes the calculation you're in the middle of making. He stepped back. Not far, just enough. On the screen behind them all, Gerald Voss's voice was saying, "The judge in the 3rd District owes 3 favors. We file there. She won't get a fair hearing anywhere else anyway. The public record we've built makes sure of that." Margaret Sterling's voice in response, "Then make sure the compliance officer's testimony is airtight before it's submitted. I don't want gaps." The deputy mayor had his phone to his ear and was moving toward the exit without attempting subtlety. One of the network anchors, a woman who had reported on Claire's divorce scandal with careful professional neutrality 3 weeks ago, was standing in front of the main screen with her own phone recording the projection, her expression doing the specific recalibration that news people do when they understand they're standing inside the story. Davis Sterling finally moved. He walked toward Claire. She saw him coming and held herself very still. Every person who had been watching the screens was now also watching him. The room had become something between a ballroom and a theater, and the scene that was about to happen at its center was going to be witnessed by people who were already recording it. He stopped in front of her. His face had the quality of someone who had not slept in the time it took to arrive at this moment, even though the time was only the 12 minutes since she'd walked in. He looked older than the man she'd watched from a car window at the hotel entrance. The event lighting that made everyone look significant had stopped working for him somewhere between the bar and here. "Claire," he said. "Davis." "I didn't know about the federal charges," he said. She looked at him. "I need you to know that I didn't—" "Davis." Her voice was even. Not cold, just even. "I know you didn't build it. I also know you didn't stop it. I don't have a category for that right now. I might someday." She paused. "But not tonight." He opened his mouth, closed it. He looked at Vincent, standing beside her. Something happened in his face. Not anger, not surprise, something more complicated. The look of a man encountering all at once the distance between who he had been in someone's life and who was standing beside them now. He looked back at Claire, and then he stepped back. One step, turned, and walked away. The audio had finished. The screens were now displaying a static document, the full financial record of the Veritex acquisition, dated, signed, with the regulatory approval chain visible in its entirety. Just sitting there. Let anyone read it who wanted to. The room was loud again, but it was a different kind of loud. Not the social roar of a charity gala doing its work, but the urgent electric noise of a crisis making itself known, of 600 people simultaneously processing and communicating and deciding what this meant for every relationship and arrangement they'd walked into this ballroom with. The man in plain clothes had not moved from his position 8 feet away. He was on his phone now, listening more than speaking. Catherine was beside Claire, close enough that Claire could hear her breathing. Quick, controlled, the breathing of someone managing adrenaline through professional discipline. "They're not going to arrest you tonight," Catherine said quietly. "Not with every camera in this room and the audio already uploading to 40 different feeds." "Are you sure?" Claire said. Catherine looked at the man with the phone. "Mostly sure," she said. It was not a satisfying answer. Claire accepted it. She felt Vincent's hand settle briefly at the small of her back. Not possessive, not performative, just present. Contact that said, "I'm here." The next 30 seconds, and the 30 after that, and whatever comes after those. The man in plain clothes lowered his phone. He looked at Claire one more time. His face was unreadable in the professional way of people trained to make it unreadable. Then he said, to someone on the phone rather than to her, Stand down. We need to wait for direction from the DA's office before we proceed." He lowered the phone. He looked at Claire one final time, not with hostility, not with apology, with the specific blankness of a man who has just been told the ground beneath a decision has shifted and needs a moment to find new footing. Then he moved toward the exit, phone already back at his ear, and did not look back. Claire breathed. It was not a dramatic breath. It was the kind of breath you take when something you've been bracing against doesn't arrive, and your body needs a second to recalibrate around the absence of impact. She became aware of her own hands. She'd been holding them at her sides and they were stiff, and she flexed her fingers once and let them relax. The room around her was still loud, still recording, still processing. She looked at the screens where the Veritex financial document sat in clean black and white, and understood that the document would be on the internet in less than 10 minutes. That the audio was already there, that the specific and verifiable and data-stamped record of what had been done, and by whom, and using which instruments, was now in the hands of 600 people who had not walked into this room expecting to receive it and would spend the rest of the evening deciding what to do with what they knew. Catherine touched her arm. "We should move, not out, just away from the center, somewhere with a wall behind us." They moved to the eastern side of the room, near a set of columns that gave them a clear sight line to most of the space and a barrier at their backs. Marco was already positioned nearby, which Claire noticed and didn't remark on. Vincent moved with them and then slightly apart from them, the way he managed space, present but not crowding, aware of everything without performing his awareness. Margaret Sterling had not left. That was the thing Claire kept registering as she scanned the room. The senator had gone. The deputy mayor had gone. 3 men she didn't know by name but recognized from the financial industry cluster near the entrance had melted away in the previous 7 minutes. Gerald Voss was visible near the bar, not drinking, just standing with his phone, his face doing the internal legal calculus of a man who has just watched 20 years of careful work get played on a ballroom screen. But Margaret Sterling was standing exactly where she'd been when the audio started. She had not moved toward the exit. She had not reached for her phone. She was standing near the stage with her hands clasped at her waist and her chin level, and she was looking at Claire from 40 feet away with an expression that Claire could not, even now, read as defeated. It was something else, something older and more durable than defeat. It was assessment. She was still assessing. Claire walked toward her. She didn't plan it. There was no moment of decision she could point to afterward. No internal deliberation, no chosen resolve. Her feet simply moved, and the crowd parted around her the way crowds part around a person moving with clear intention. and she crossed the ballroom floor toward the woman who had spent 2 months building a version of her life designed to be permanent. She stopped 4 feet away. Margaret Sterling looked at her. Up close, in the event lighting, she looked exactly like herself. That was the thing about people built from a certain kind of material. Circumstances that disassembled other people left them looking the same. Silver hair precise, posture unbroken, eyes carrying the particular quality of a person who has never once, in 7 decades, woken up and been uncertain about who they were. "You should have taken the settlement," Margaret said. Claire held her gaze. "I know you believe that." $3.4 million, Margaret said. Then $6 million. You could have walked away clean, built a life somewhere. A pause. Instead, you're standing in a ballroom with Vincent Moretti next to what's left of your reputation, and you think you've won something. "I think the people in this room heard your voice on a recording," Claire said. "That's not something I think. That's something that happened." "Recordings can be challenged," Margaret said. "Provenance questioned, sources discredited." She said it without heat, a statement of operational fact. "This evening is an event, a disruption. What comes after it is a process, and processes take time, and in that time, Claire said, federal investigators who have been building a separate case involving the Veritex acquisition for the past 8 months will receive what they need to move forward." She watched Margaret's face. A small thing happened around the eyes, contained immediately, but there. "You didn't know about the separate investigation." Margaret was silent for a beat. "The PAC filings were already flagged," Claire said. "Catherine's been in contact with the lead investigator for 2 weeks. What happened tonight didn't start the case. It accelerated it." She paused. "The recordings are evidence, but they're not the whole evidence. They're the piece that makes everything else make sense to everyone who wasn't already looking." The room around them had developed a specific quality, a radius of space that had opened up, guests who were close enough to see the conversation but keeping a distance that acknowledged they were witnessing something that had its own gravity. Phones were still up. The network anchor Claire had noticed earlier was 30 feet away, not filming this particular exchange, just watching. Margaret Sterling looked at Claire with an expression that had shifted, not much, and not toward anything that resembled regret or accountability, but toward something honest in its own way. The look of a person encountering finally the actual size of what they were dealing with. "You were nobody," she said. It wasn't cruel. It was almost puzzled. "You were a girl from Montana who answered an RFP and got too close." "Yes," Claire said, "and you've—" She stopped, looked at the room, looked back. "How?" "I stayed," Claire said. It was the whole answer. Margaret Sterling, for all her intelligence, appeared not to fully understand it. That was all right. Some things you either already knew or you didn't, and no amount of explaining changed which category you were in. Claire turned and walked back across the room. The next 4 hours were not cinematic. They were the bureaucratic aftermath of a crisis, statements given to hotel management, calls made in hallways. Catherine on 3 phones simultaneously. Vincent's people cycling through the space with the quiet efficiency of a cleanup crew that had anticipated the shape of what needed doing. The gala officially ended at 9:30, venue staff moving through the room with the practiced neutrality of people who had managed events that went sideways before. Guests left in clusters, some fast, some slowly, and in conversation, processing what they'd seen in real time. A woman from the Sterling Foundation's board approached Claire near the exit at 10 and introduced herself as Diane Marsh, a name Claire knew from the Foundation's letterhead. She said she had been a board member for 11 years. She said the board would be convening an emergency session. She said she was sorry for what Claire had experienced, and that she meant that personally and not institutionally. Then she shook Claire's hand and left. Davis was gone by the time Claire thought to look for him again. The network anchor did find her briefly near the coat check at 10:15. A professional approach, card extended, request for a comment or an interview at Claire's convenience. Claire took the card and said she'd be in touch through her attorney, and meant it, which was different from every previous version of that phrase she'd deployed over the past 2 months when she'd meant the opposite. Catherine was in a car outside making calls when Claire finally got her coat and walked out of the hotel into the cold November air. Vincent was on the sidewalk. He was standing alone. Marco and Dante were visible near the cars, but Vincent was a few feet separate from them, looking up the avenue at the stream of late Friday traffic. The hotel lights caught the gray at his temples. He had his hands in his coat pockets. He looked like someone allowing himself, very briefly, to be just a person standing on a sidewalk, not managing anything. She stood beside him. "It held," she said. "Yes," he said. They stood there for a moment, the city doing its indifferent continuous thing around them. "The man from the DA's office," she said. He stood down. "His supervisor called him," Vincent said. "The filing that the federal investigation made this afternoon created a jurisdictional complication. The local warrant is now subordinate to a federal proceeding. Your arrest tonight would have created a chain of custody nightmare for both sides." He paused. Catherine saw it coming. That's why she pushed for 2 weeks. Claire absorbed this. She knew the federal investigation would move this week. "She helped ensure it would," he said. She looked at him. "You helped ensure it would." He met her eyes. "I made an introduction," he said. "The federal investigators made their own decisions based on what they saw. An introduction to people you know." "I know a lot of people," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Is there anything that happened over the last 2 months," she said, "that you didn't have a hand in at some level?" He thought about it. "The compliance officer's decision to call Voss. I didn't anticipate that. That nearly ended everything." "Yes," he said. "It did." He looked at her directly. "I'm not a system without failures. I'm a person who has more information than most people and more resources than most people and who makes mistakes at higher stakes than most people." She nodded slowly. She'd known that. She'd chosen to work within it. The choice felt, standing here on the other side of it, like something she would make again. "What happens now?" she said. "Tonight, you sleep. Tomorrow, Catherine manages the next phase. The federal investigation is its own process, and it moves on its own timeline." He paused. "You won't be arrested. The charges will be challenged and ultimately dismissed when the prosecutorial misconduct is established. That will take months, possibly longer. It won't be clean. But it'll happen." "Yes," he said. "It'll happen." She looked up the avenue. Taxis and private cars and the occasional person on foot navigating the sidewalk around the gala's exiting guests. November New York, cold enough that her breath was visible, warm enough that it wasn't punishing. She'd been in this city for 8 years. She'd spent 2 months of those 8 years being systematically erased from it, and she was still here. "I want to go somewhere quiet," she said. "I know a place," he said. The place was a restaurant in the West Village that didn't advertise, where the tables were set wide apart and the lighting was low and the staff moved with the specific, unhurried calm of a room that had never been interested in being discovered by the kind of people who needed to be seen at places. The owner, a small man named Enzo, who had the particular warmth of someone who had spent 40 years feeding people and had decided long ago that this was sufficient, sat them himself at a corner table and said nothing about the evening news, which was already carrying the gala story on 3 networks. They ate. Real food, slowly. She had pasta she didn't fully taste, but ate anyway because her body reminded her, somewhere around the second course, that she'd had almost nothing since morning. He ordered wine she didn't know, and it was good, and she drank 2 glasses over the course of 2 hours without feeling anything except, gradually, the return of something she recognized as herself. Not the self of the past 2 months, not the self of the Sterling marriage, but some older and more baseline version. Montana. Practical. Stubborn in the way of people who come from places where stubborn was not a flaw but a survival feature. They talked about small things, about a river she'd grown up near in Billings that flooded every 3 years without fail, and that the town had simply arranged its life around rather than trying to change. About a restaurant in Palermo he'd been to in his 20s that had no menu, just whatever the kitchen had decided to make that day, and how it had been the best meal of his life. About things that had nothing to do with the evening and everything to do with what kind of people they each were when the structure of crisis wasn't organizing them. She asked him, at some point in the second hour, what he was going to do next, not tactically, as a person. He was quiet for a moment, turned his wine glass once. "There are parts of what I've built," he said, "that I've known for some time need to change." He said it without drama, the way you say things you've been thinking privately for long enough that they no longer feel dangerous to admit. I'm not describing a transformation, I'm describing a direction, the intelligence side, the security work, the legitimate businesses. Those are functional and real, and I don't apologize for them. The rest, he paused. The rest has costs I've been accounting for in ways I don't want to keep accounting for. Because of tonight, she said. Not because of tonight, he said. Tonight clarified a direction I'd already been moving in. He looked at her. You clarified things, not tonight, over time. She held his gaze. She thought about an October alley and a man on the ground who had told her not to stay, and what it meant that she had stayed without knowing any of what she now knew. She thought about the specific quality of decisions made without full information, which was the quality of most important decisions. You never had full information. You made the choice that the person you were, in that moment, with what you knew, would make. And then you lived in the direction of that choice until the information caught up. I'm not going to pretend, she said, that the next several months are going to be easy. The charges being dismissed is a process. My reputation, she paused. The stories that ran about me are still out there. They'll always be out there. People will always be able to find them. I'm not going to wake up one day and have all of that be gone. No, he said. And what we are... She stopped, found a different way in. Whatever this is, it isn't simple. No, he said again. I'm not asking you to tell me it is, she said. I'm telling you I know it isn't, and I'm here anyway, and I need you to understand the difference between those two things. He looked at her for a long moment. The restaurant was quiet around them. A few other tables, low voices, Enzo moving somewhere at the back. The kind of quiet that a city produces not often enough. The quiet of a room where nothing is performing. I understand the difference, Vincent said. The weeks that followed moved in the irregular rhythms of aftermath. The federal investigation confirmed what the Veritex financial documents suggested. A bribery structure connecting Sterling Industries' acquisition of the pharmaceutical company to 2 political appointees and 1 regulatory official, coordinated through a network of passee contributions that had been designed to be technically legal and were, in the end, not. The lead investigator, a woman named Chen, who communicated entirely through Catherine and who Claire never met in person, issued a statement at week 3 that the investigation was ongoing and that no further comment would be made until charges were formally filed. Gerald Voss resigned from his position as Sterling Family Counsel on a Tuesday, citing personal reasons. His law firm issued no further statement. The senator who had moved toward the exit in the first minutes of the gala recording announced 11 days after the event that he would not be seeking re-election. His office attributed this to a desire to spend more time with family. Nobody who had been in the ballroom that night believed it. The federal charges against Claire, the wire fraud, the corporate espionage, the fabricated document theft, were formally challenged by Catherine through an emergency motion arguing prosecutorial misconduct supported by the audio recordings and the financial evidence. The motion was heard by a federal judge who was not on anyone's list of favorable jurisdictions and who granted a stay of proceedings pending investigation of the conduct of the deputy DA's office. The stay was indefinite. Effectively, the charges were frozen. Not gone. Not yet. But frozen. Margaret Sterling gave no public statement. She appeared at no events. The Sterling Foundation's board completed its emergency session and issued a statement announcing a review of governance practices and the appointment of an independent oversight committee. Margaret's name did not appear in any subsequent foundation communication. Sterling Industries' stock dropped 31% over the 2 weeks following the gala. Several institutional investors divested. 2 board members resigned. The company issued a statement about ongoing compliance reviews and new leadership commitments that had the specific quality of language written by someone who understood the structure of accountability without quite having arrived at its meaning. Davis called her once. She almost didn't answer. She stood in the kitchen of the Hell's Kitchen apartment. She'd moved back there. The penthouse was Vincent's space, and she'd needed her own, even if it was smaller and less protected, and looked at his name on her screen for 4 rings before she picked up. He sounded tired. He said he was sorry. He said it without preface or structure, just the words. She held the phone and listened and let the apology exist in the space without immediately deciding what it was worth or what it cost him or what it changed. I let it happen, he said. I didn't build it, but I let it happen. I need you to know that I know that. She thought about the man she'd married, the parts of him she genuinely loved, because there were parts. His humor when he was at ease, his occasional moments of surprising gentleness, the specific way he'd looked at her across a table early in their relationship with an expression she'd believed completely and had later revised. The revision didn't erase the original. It just made the original smaller and more accurately sized. I know you know it, she said. A pause. Are you okay? He said. It was a strange question given everything. It was also, she thought, probably the most honest thing he'd ever asked her. I'm getting there, she said. She meant it. That was what surprised her. She meant it not as reassurance or performance, but as actual assessment of her actual state. She was getting there. It was not a metaphor. It was a process with friction and a direction. She got the position at the foundation 6 weeks after the gala. Not the Sterling Foundation, a different organization entirely, international in scope, focused specifically on providing legal and financial resources to people caught in institutional corruption cases. The executive director, a woman named Abena, who had spent 20 years doing this work across 3 continents, called Claire directly. She said she'd been watching the case. She said she knew the difference between someone who had survived something and someone who had learned something in the surviving, and that she thought Claire was the second kind of person. Claire said she'd like to think about it. She thought about it for 48 hours, which was how long she generally needed to be certain of something large. Then she called back and said yes. The work was not easy work. It was not clean or quick or organized into satisfying units of progress. It was the work of sitting across from people who had lost everything they could document and helping them build a case from the pieces that remained. And it required a very specific kind of patience, not the passive patience of waiting, but the active patience of someone who knows the process has a direction, even when the direction is not visible from where you're currently standing. She was good at it. She was good at it in a way that surprised her only slightly, because it was the same skill she'd used to survive the past 4 months, applied outward instead of inward. She and Vincent settled into something that didn't have a clean name. He didn't move in with her. She didn't move back to the penthouse. What they had was time, in the specific and deliberate way that time is something you choose to give rather than something that simply happens between people who occupy the same space. He came to the West Village restaurant on Thursday evenings when she could make it, and he wasn't traveling, and neither of them had something more urgent. And on the nights when she couldn't sleep, she sometimes called him at 2 a.m, and he always answered, and they talked about things that were not urgent and not strategic, just the ongoing contents of being alive and noticing the world. He had started the process of separating certain operations from the organization's structure, quiet, slow, in ways that didn't announce themselves because announcements created instability, and instability was expensive. She knew about it without discussing it in detail, because some things are better understood sideways than directly. She trusted him in the specific way you trust someone who has been present at your worst, which is different from the trust you extend to someone who has only seen you assembled. It was a trust with full information, not a trust that required ignorance to sustain itself. That distinction mattered to her. It was, in fact, the whole thing. Winter moved toward spring in the way that New York winter moves, reluctantly, with reversals, with the specific quality of a city that has no patience for seasons that won't resolve. Claire walked to work most mornings through streets that were gradually lightening, and she ate lunch near a window that was gradually admitting more afternoon sun. And she went home in evenings that were gradually lengthening, and the gradualness of all of it was something she found, in a way she would not have predicted 4 months ago, almost exactly what she needed. She was not the same person who had sat in a conference room on Park Avenue and refused a pen. She'd known that for a while. What she'd been working out in the months since was whether the person she'd become was someone she wanted to be. Not whether she'd made the right choices. That was a separate question, and in some ways less interesting. But whether the person those choices had produced was someone worth being. She thought about this on a Sunday afternoon in late March, standing on the roof of her building with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands, and the city laid out around her in the particular clarity of a cold, bright day. She could see all the way to the bridges in one direction. She could hear the specific layered noise of the city doing its continuous business, traffic and voices and construction, and the far sound of something she couldn't identify, but that was definitely New York, definitely this, definitely now. The woman who had been humiliated in a conference room and driven out of a job and out of her apartment and out of her life was still inside her. She was not gone. She was not erased. She was not something that had been cleanly resolved and filed. She lived alongside everything else. That was, Claire understood now, the actual shape of surviving something. Not the disappearance of what had been done to you, but its integration, its weight becoming familiar and eventually portable. You carried it differently over time, that was all. You carried it until it was part of how you moved, rather than something that stopped you from moving. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Weather's good. The Hudson Path near the 79th Street Boat Basin. An hour? Vincent. She looked at the city, drank the last of the cold coffee, put the cup down on the ledge. She typed back, 20 minutes, I'm already out. She took the stairs instead of the elevator because the stairs were faster and she had somewhere to be, and she pushed through the building's front door into the cold, bright Sunday air and turned toward the river, and she walked, not quickly, not slowly, at the pace of someone who knows where they're going and is not afraid of getting there. The path along the Hudson was half full with the specific Sunday morning mix of the city at rest. Joggers, families, dogs pulling in different directions, a man sitting on a bench reading a physical newspaper with the absorbed focus of a person who had decided to be exactly where he was. The river moved alongside all of it, gray-green and enormous and entirely unimpressed by any of it. She found him at the boat basin bench before he saw her. He was sitting with his hands on his knees, looking at the water. Without the coat and the Tribeca rooms and the operational gravity that surrounded him in working hours, he looked like a man in his late 40s on a Sunday morning who was tired in the way that people who have carried things for a long time are tired. Not acutely, not dramatically, just tired in the background, the way a sound becomes part of the silence it inhabits. She sat beside him. He looked at her. Some of the tiredness rearranged itself. You said 20 minutes, he said. I walked fast. The river moved. A boat was visible in the distance, small against the water. The bridge beyond it stood exactly where it had always stood, connecting things that would otherwise be separate. She thought about what Catherine had said to her once, in a moment that had not been significant when it happened and had become significant in retrospect. Some cases you win in the room, and some cases you win over time. The ones you win over time are more durable. She thought it was probably true about more than cases. The investigator from the Chen team called Catherine yesterday, she said. I heard, he said. Formal charges against 2 of the PAC administrators next week. The regulatory official is cooperating. She paused. It's happening. Yes, he said. It is. She leaned back on the bench and tilted her face toward the cold March sun and let the warmth of it, real warmth, weak but real, settle on her skin. Eyes closed for a moment, just that. She thought about Montana, about rivers that flooded every 3 years and towns that built around the flooding rather than pretending it wouldn't come. About her mother, who had raised her to fix the problem in front of her rather than the problem she wished was in front of her. About the night in October 3 years ago, when she'd walked into an alley because a person was on the ground, and she was the kind of person who walked toward things that needed her. She had not known, that night, what she was beginning. You never did. She opened her eyes, looked at the river, looked at the man beside her, who was looking at the river too, both of them watching the same water move in the same direction toward the same place neither of them needed to name. I'm not running, she said. It was for both of them, and neither of them required any explanation of it. Neither am I, he said. The river moved. The city held its noise. The Sunday went on around them in all its ordinary and unremarkable continuity, which was, Claire thought, was, in fact, the whole point, the entire hard-won substance of everything the last 4 months had cost and built and broken and made, exactly what she had been fighting for. Not the dramatic version, not the cinematic version, the ordinary one, the one where you woke up in the morning in your own life, in a city that didn't owe you anything and didn't need to, and you went out into it anyway, and you were still there.